I have a ton of data, I have a ton of explaining, so we're going to dive right into it. So y'all know last week what we did is I looked at the 5 worst teams in the NFL every single season over the past 10 years. We looked at the running back one on that offense, and we looked at their finish from a fantasy football perspective, and we came away with the conclusion that running backs and horrible offenses have a very hard time being league winners in fantasy, turning out to actually be top 10, top 5 options. What I wanted to do is I wanted to look at the exact opposite. I want to look at running backs that are in elite offenses, running backs that over the past 10 years were the running back ones for the 5 highest scoring offenses in the NFL every season over the past 10 years. That's 50 running backs, and see how often are they relevant in fantasy? How often do you have a situation like the Chiefs 2 years ago where Jerick McKinnon's the RB1 in fantasy and nobody's really startable even though it's the best offense in the NFL? So just as an example, going to 2023, the best offenses in the NFL from a total points scored perspective were the Cowboys, Niners, Dolphins, Ravens, Lions. We looked at the running back ones there, which were Tony Pollard, Christian McCaffrey, Raheem Mostert, Gus Edwards, Jahmyr Gibbs. We looked at their fantasy football finish from a half PPR points per game perspective, which was the RB22, the RB1, the RB3, the RB28, the RB11, and we did this every single season over the past 10 years. Now, I'm not going to go through every single year. I don't want to waste your time. We have a lot to talk about at the end of this video, trying to figure out what running backs we should be drafting this season based off offensive projections. But you can see all the data on the screen. Just pause it if you want to evaluate it. But what I wanted to do is make life easy for you. We took this sample size of 50 running backs and to come away with some concrete conclusions to be able to compare it to the 5 worst offenses in the NFL and the running back ones from those offenses over the past 10 seasons, we came up with the same thresholds. We are looking at RB24, RB12, and being a top 5 running back, those cutoffs. So can you be a running back 2 in fantasy? Can you be an RB1 in fantasy? Can you be a league winner, aka a top 5 running back? So here what we found was in the bottom 5 offenses every year over the past 10 years, if you were the RB1 in a bottom 5 offense in the league, you had about a 52% chance of being a top 24 guy in fantasy. So it's a coin flip if you were going to be a top 24 player. Whereas if you were looking at the good offenses, the top 5 offenses in the league, you had a 76% chance of being a top 24 option. So no, it's not a guarantee that you're a top 24 guy just because you're in a top 5 offense. Look at Gus Edwards this past year. Look at Jerick McKinnon 2 years ago. Look at Devin Singletary 2 years ago. There are examples of those guys not finishing in the top 24, but let's move on to top 12. If you were in a bad offense, aka bottom 5 offense in the league, you had a 20% chance to finish inside the top 12 of running back rankings that season. Whereas if you were in a top 5 offense, that 20% chance went up to 56%. It almost tripled. Now, what's even crazier is looking at the true league winners, looking at the guys that were inside the top 5 finishers at the running back position. In bad offenses, you had a 4% chance. In the elite offenses, you had a 26% chance. That's almost 7x. Massive differences. My takeaway here is while it is more likely if you're in a top 5 offense in the NFL that you finish as a top 24 guy than if you were in a bottom 5 offense, there's not a massive gap between those two options. Where the massive gap comes into play is really the only way you can hit that top 5 upside is if you're an elite offense or a very good offense at the minimum. If you want a running back that can be a true league winner, taking somebody that projects out to be in a great offense is probably the path. Now, does that mean that you should just ignore running backs in bad offenses? No, because of course, while we may think an offense is going to be bad going into this next season, you could always have a Houston Texans situation where the Texans are projected out to be a bad offense because there's a wide range of outcomes on CJ Stroud. People really don't know what to expect. And turns out that CJ Stroud is an MVP level quarterback as a rookie and they exceed expectations. So just because we think an offense is going to be good, just because we think an offense is going to be bad going into the year, doesn't mean that it's a guarantee, but we just have to be the most accurate predictors of that we can possibly be. Because I'm going to let you in on a secret, okay? This is something that I've tried to keep close to my chest. I've tried not to let anybody know for a very long time. But nobody knows for 100% certainty what is going to happen. Duh. Don't go to the comment section and scream at me. Well, Mason, maybe it doesn't. Of course I know maybe it doesn't happen. Of course I know these Vegas projections may be wrong. Are you freaking kidding me? But I would make the argument that Vegas has more information, more sources, and more resources, and the most at stake with these sports books to put out the most accurate projections this season that we can possibly find. I would make the argument that Las Vegas sportsbooks and line makers know more than you do, know more than I do, and know more than anybody on YouTube does. I promise you right now, DraftKings, FanDuel, they spend hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising because they know that their lines are very good and they know that they are going to make money over the long haul. But anyway, that's besides the point. What we are doing here is we are looking at Las Vegas sportsbook projections, and we are looking at the implied team totals. This isn't just over-unders in terms of total wins at the end of the season. This is how many points these offenses project to score out every single week, added up through the course of the entire season to then get offensive rankings where the Niners project out to be the best offense in the league. The Lions project to score the second most points. The Chiefs expect to score the third most points. The Dolphins, the Bills. We're even going to throw in the Bengals. We're going to throw in Baltimore. We're going to talk about Derrick Henry. We're going to talk about the Dallas running backs. Because even though they don't project out to be top 5 offenses in the league, like we said, there's a lot of randomness. We are going to acknowledge the fact that just because a team projects out to be the top 5 offense in the league doesn't mean it's guaranteed, right? They're just probably more likely than the Tennessee Titans are. Okay. But anyway, let's start it off with Christian McCaffrey. Super brief with CMC. Christian McCaffrey is currently projected out to be the best offense in the league. He was the best running back in fantasy last season. He averaged 22.5 fantasy points per game. What is there to talk about? Okay. If you're looking at CMC, the only possible red flag is going to be a 28-year-old running back this next season. He's coming off the most touches in the NFL. So maybe he's at a little bit more of an injury risk. Really, the only thing is if you're in an underdog draft where running back is going to be so easy to find value later on and wide receiver is going to be extremely difficult to find value, I understand if you want to go CeeDee Lamb over Christian McCaffrey. I did so at the beginning of the season. And then we saw the underdog pick'ems that got put out where Christian McCaffrey's projection was 5.5 receiving touchdowns, 11.5 rushing touchdowns, 500.5 receiving yards, almost 1,200 rushing yards. So underdogs pick'ems have CMC at like, what? 17 total touchdowns, almost 17 total, 100 total yards. I think you kind of have to just go ahead and take CMC at 1. There's not a lot to talk about. And yeah, I was, especially in your regular redraft league, if you're playing on ESPN, if you're playing on Yahoo, just with your college buddies, take CMC at 1 for the love of God. Don't overthink it. But going over to the offense that is at the second projection right now, Gibbs Montgomery is a little bit more of an interesting conversation to have. Jahmyr Gibbs, as a 21-year-old rookie last year, phenomenal season. 14.5 points per game, 12 carries per game, 3.5 receptions per game, 21 receiving yards per game. What's very interesting is if you look at all 21-year-old running backs since the year 2000, the guys that Gibbs comps to, you have Lev Bell, Jonathan Taylor, Josh Jacobs, Marshawn Lynch, Maurice Jones-Drew, Todd Gurley, Kerryon Johnson, Jamal Lewis, Bijan Robinson. The following season, from a points per game perspective, you had both Jonathan Taylor as well as Le'Veon Bell in their age 22 seasons, eclipsing over 22 points per game and being pure league winners. Josh Jacobs, Marshawn Lynch were both at about 15.5 points per game and still very solid options. Really, the only instance that we had of someone busting the next year was Jamal Lewis back in the year 2000. So honestly, it's over 20 years ago. Who freaking cares? Gibbs is on a path to be great. This should be a phenomenal offensive line. Jahmyr Gibbs, his underdog pick'em right now is at 900.5 rushing yards, 350.5 receiving yards, and 7.5 rushing touchdowns. I'm taking him every chance I get at the 1-2 turn. And in your regular redraft league, if you're drafting with your buddies on ESPN, on Yahoo, and you only start 2 wide receivers and 1 flex, I would take Jahmyr Gibbs even earlier than the end of the first round, the beginning of the second round. I think you could push Jahmyr Gibbs up in that format up to like pick 8, pick 9. Now, everything in this offense comes down to what your expectations are for the red zone role here between Montgomery and Gibbs. There was a difference at the beginning of the year versus the end of the year in this split. The beginning of the season, David Montgomery got every single touch in the red zone. The second that this Lions team got inside the 10-yard line, they went, Gibbs, get your ass out of there. We're sending Montgomery in. And yeah, David Montgomery, here's your free touchdown. That happened until the David Montgomery injury. Then what happened was Jahmyr Gibbs then had that red zone role. Jahmyr Gibbs had a ton of success with said red zone role. And then once David Montgomery came back from his injury, it looked way more like okay, whoever's on the field, y'all can have the touches at the goal line. If Gibbs is the one who got us there, Gibbs will let you punch it in. If Montgomery was on the field and we get inside the 5-yard line, Montgomery, you can have it. If that's the case going into this next season, Dave Montgomery can still be viable in fantasy if he is going to get half of those red zone opportunities. My only hesitation is I would naturally expect that the running back going into his age 22 season that was just selected at 12 overall of the NFL draft, I would expect that player to continue to increase his role rather than take a step backwards. And I think we see that with the historical data as well. But we know based off what we've seen that this is an offense that can put out a top 5 running back. This is what the projections are telling us this next year. It all comes down to what you expect for the red zone role in Detroit. Looking at the underdog pick'em, Dave Montgomery currently is at 8.5 rushing touchdowns, which is one more rushing touchdown than what you have with Jahmyr Gibbs. And of course, if you wanted to either get in a draft or if you wanted to go take any of those pick'ems yourself, that's both on Underdog Fantasy. It's where I draft every single night on the live stream. It's where I've drafted every night on the live stream for freaking years. It's best ball, so there's no time commitment at all during the season. It's how I draft hundreds of teams. It's how I won $150,000 on Underdog 2 years ago. And yeah, if you wanted to join a draft with us any night, you can find that link in the description, in the comment section. Code FLOCK will get you hooked up with my 2024 Fantasy Football Draft Guide, my 2024 Fantasy Football Rankings, and Code FLOCK will get you hooked up with a 50% deposit bonus up to $250 as well. But let's move over to Isaiah Pacheco, because I think Pacheco's the first guy that it's actually interesting to talk about, because the issue is if you are looking at what you have with Gibbs, McCaffrey, it's like, oh, cool story, Mason. Thanks for telling me Jahmyr Gibbs being drafted at RB5 and Christian McCaffrey being drafted at RB1 have top 5 upside. You're not helping me at all. Pacheco's where we get to the first real conversation. Isaiah Pacheco currently in underdog drafts is going right before Christian Kirk, Travis Etienne, and he's going directly after T. Higgins, Jalen Hurts. He is the RB10. He is in a range where I would make an argument that wide receiver is kind of gross. I am of the opinion that in these underdog drafts in particular, I have no interest in taking Terry McLaurin. I have no interest in taking Christian Kirk if the cost is going to be where you have to take one of these guys over a running back like Pacheco that has top 5 upside at his position. Pacheco is extremely reasonably priced there. This is a running back that's gotten better going into his second season. He jumped from 0.8 receptions per game up to 3.1 receptions per game. He jumped up to 14.5 carries per contest. I mean, he jumped up to almost 14 points per game in a half PPR format. So you're seeing a running back dramatically improve. You're seeing less competition in his backfield, and you're seeing an offense that projects out to be one of the best offenses in the league. Now, what's going to be very interesting is pulling up the Pacheco ESPN ADP and cross-referencing this with Underdog. So if you're in a league with your college buddies, to be honest with you, I am not going to sit here and say that Isaiah Pacheco is some massive value and you just have to draft as much Isaiah Pacheco as you can. Because here in this kind of league, Pacheco's going right before Devontae Adams. He's going before Marvin Harrison Jr., Chris Olave, Sam Laporta, Josh Allen, Mahomes, Kelsey. It's just a significantly higher cost as a mid-second round pick in comparison to a mid-4th round pick on Underdog. I'm not telling you not to draft Pacheco in your ESPN redraft league. I just think that he's already appropriately a price for his upside where I can't scream at you, oh my gosh, you just have to get your hands on him. What's actually very interesting is if you instead look at Devon Achane, where right now the Miami Dolphins are projected out to be the 4th highest scoring offense in the league. Achane has a very different price than what you were seeing with Pacheco. So right now on Underdog, Devon Achane goes to the 2-3 turn. He is the RB7 currently, whereas we discussed Isaiah Pacheco goes at the end of the 4th round. However, if you're looking at your regular ESPN redraft league, if you're just hopping in with your college buddies, Instead of being the RB7, Devon Achane there is the RB13. He is, instead of going at the 2-3 turn, going near the end of the third round, the beginning of the fourth round. Achane is a super interesting player for a bunch of different reasons. One, this is a Miami Dolphins offense that should project out to score a zillion points for the running back position this next year. That's at least what happened last season. We'll talk about Raheem Mostert in just 1 second. Two, Devon Achane last year arguably was one of, if not the most efficient running backs in NFL history. He averaged 9.4 carries per game. However, he averaged almost 73 rushing yards per game. Achane was averaging about 8 yards per carry as a rookie. And what we historically see for all rookies, whether it's at running back, whether it's at wide receiver, the guys that are going to come out and turn into the elite level players at their respective positions, whether that's CeeDee Lamb, whether that's Justin Jefferson, maybe a better example wide receiver would be Tyreek Hill back in the day. You go back to Tyreek Hill's first breakout season, what you saw was a wide receiver where the efficiency was just off the charts, where he was dominating from a per touch perspective, where very few players were able to compete at the NFL level at his position, which is exactly what we saw from Achane last year. But we know efficiency is going to be one of the hardest things to maintain at the NFL and one of the most volatile things from a year-to-year perspective. But typically you see that rookie in year one put up a hyper-efficient season and you go, okay, I'm going to draft the hell out of him going into year two because I understand, well, yeah, he's not going to average 8 yards per carry again. That's probably going to come down to be a lot closer to 5 yards per carry, which is still an incredible amount, right? But he's going to come back down to earth. If he averages 8 yards per carry through the rest of his NFL career, he's going to go down as the best running back in NFL history. That's probably not happening with Devon Achane. Don't want to burst your bubble. But what you typically see is you see the volume go up so much because the team goes, he's one of our most talented players. Let's involve him way more in the game plan this year. And his fantasy football value actually goes up. Like, let's say Devon Achane this next season goes from 8 yards per carry down to 5, but he goes from 9.5 carries per game up to 15. Achane will be a better option in fantasy this year than he was a year ago. Now, my hesitation with Devon Achane is while we would naturally assume that you get the volume bump following the efficiency fall, or hand in hand, they go together. Achane weighs 188 pounds. And if we go through and if we look at running backs, let's just look at the best RB seasons that have happened since the year 2000 for RBs that weighed 188 pounds or less. You had Devon Achane this past season putting up the best running back year pretty much in NFL history ever at a running back with this size. Afterwards, the only other running backs to average 10 points per game or more at 188 pounds or less were Warrick Dunn and Tariq Cohen. Those were the only guys to have ever done it. The reason being is that a 188-pound running back, historically speaking, this is what's happened since the year 2000. I'm not saying this can't change going into the future. They have not been able to hold up to a workload where they're seeing 20 touches per game. If they're going to be viable in fantasy, you have to be Warrick Dunn averaging 42 receiving yards per game. You have to be Tariq Cohen averaging 45 receiving yards per game. Tariq Cohen's averaging more receiving yards per game than rushing yards per game. That's what we saw from those running backs at this size that were fantasy relevant. So Achane is a massive outlier where it's very difficult to assume that he's just going to go out there and expand his role this next season and have so many more touches. You see this right now with his underdog projected pick'em, where he's at 750.5 rushing yards. It's going to be much lower than the other running backs that he's going around. So personally, if I'm drafting on Underdog, I'll pass. Yes, he can give me spike weeks. Yes, I understand why people are drafting him. But instead of taking Devon Achane at pick 24, I would way rather just have Kyren Williams in the mid-third round. Whereas if I'm drafting on ESPN, where instead of having to take Devon Achane as the running back 7, if I'm drafting with my college buddies and I can get him at RB13, yes, please. I'll take him. While there is downside based off his overall size and how he looks like an outlier historically, based off how efficient he was as a rookie and based off how damn good this offense projects out to be this next season, what this data tells us about good offenses equal good running back production, I think at 13, he's almost a must-draft guy on ESPN. Now, a big reason for that is, I'm sorry, I missed Raheem Mostert last year. I drafted Achane last year. Mostert, I completely whiffed. There's no way Mostert does this again, okay? Maybe I'm a Mostert hater. Maybe I'm just sad that I didn't get him last year. But Raheem Mostert last year averaged 17 half PPR points per game. He did this all with rushing touchdowns. He did this not at all with receptions. He averaged fewer than 2 receptions per game. And if we go and look at the best running back seasons in NFL history since the year 2000, at 32 years old, Ricky Williams, 14.5 points per game. Mike Anderson, 14 points per game. D'Angelo Williams, 13.5. Fred Jackson, 13.2. Jerome Bettis, 13.2. Frank Gore, 11.5. Really, unless Raheem Mostert's going to be the best 32-year-old running back in NFL history, we should expect a significant fall off from what we had a year ago. You see that with underdog pick'ems at the moment where Mostert's at 8.5 rushing touchdowns, where last year, the man dropped pretty much 20. Now, let's go over to James Cook. James Cook's a very interesting running back at the moment. Very different price depending on where you're drafting. James Cook improved last season, went from 6 points per game up to 12.5, went from 5.5 carries per game up to about 14, doubled his receptions, over doubled his receiving yards per game. James Cook looked like a 3-down running back in Buffalo. Buffalo projects out to be a borderline top 5 offense in the NFL this next season. And this is a pretty thin depth chart. They add in Ray Davis, but it's very difficult to assume that Ray Davis has anything more than a 30% opportunity mark. Really the only thing holding James Cook back, and why I want to say that James Cook's maybe not super applicable to this data where we can say, oh, okay, yeah, running backs in top 5 offenses typically are going to have a super high ceiling based off just how many red zone opportunities that they should have, how many opportunities for touchdowns there are going to be in this offense. The issue is when you're playing alongside a quarterback that's going to run the ball, especially in the red zone like Josh Allen, even if you don't have another prototypical running back on your depth chart, you almost just are in a running back by committee with your quarterback. I know that sounds idiotic, but where you are going to have Josh Allen vulturing rushing touchdowns here, it is very difficult to just assume, oh, good offense for Buffalo, James Cook's going to crush in the rushing touchdown department. Right now, if you look at his underdog pickup, he's at higher, lower 4.5 rushing touchdowns. If you look at where he's going in underdog drafts, he's RB 13 going at the 5-6 turn. If you look at ESPN drafts, he's RB 12 going in the middle of the 3rd round. So, I'm drafting him on underdog. If I was on ESPN, I don't necessarily know if I'm going to take him there. I'd way rather just draft Jahmyr Gibbs in round 2 than James Cook in round 3, to be honest with you, if I was drafting my college buddies. I'm going over to Cincinnati. Now, right now, the Bengals do not project out to be a top 5 offense in the league. But with that being said, they do currently project instead to be the 6th best offense, pretty damn close. Obviously, Vegas is never 1-for-1 correct. So, it wouldn't be a surprise to anybody if Burrow's fully healthy and this offense was much better. And Zach Moss was a lot better this past season than he has been pretty much ever. We saw him with no Jonathan Taylor go out there and put up weeks where he just absolutely dominated your matchup for you. If we looked at running backs that had a similar age 26 season to Zach Moss since year 2000, in their age 27 year, you did not have a single guy hitting double-digit points. In Zach Moss, you do have a large sample of him ultimately being disappointing at the NFL level. You have a very small sample where Zach Moss was a super strong option. So I was honestly kind of fine. I don't want to say ignoring Zach Moss, but not taking a ton of Zach Moss previously. He's RB 27, however, on underdog, ADP 94. If you look at his underdog pickup, he's at 850.5 rushing yards. This is higher than the Devon Achane mark. He's at 6.5 rushing touchdowns because this should be a very good offense. Really, this entire video, I want to say, for me, I'm making it so I hold myself accountable and I start drafting some of these Cincinnati Bengals running backs. As I go over and look at Chase Brown, I don't really like Chase Brown either. But this should be a very high-scoring offense. Could very easily be a top 5 offense in the league. It's not like Burrow's going to be vulturing rushing touchdowns as you are going to have, say, in Buffalo with Josh Allen. The historical data tells us that if you're in a borderline or if you're in a top 5 offense in the league, running backs more likely than not are going to put up points and they are going to have a high ceiling. So even if I'm not a big Chase Brown fan, even if I'm not a big Zach Moss fan from a talent perspective, I think at cost, you have to draft him. Like in your ESPN draft, Zach Moss, RB 29, pick 99, phenomenal pick. I would love to take him and just throw him on our bench. And then I'd almost say the same thing with Chase Brown. 141 in your ESPN draft with your college buddies, RB 43. Based off the status surrounding good offenses, I think you got to take him. Derrick Henry should be in a much better offense this season. Obviously, I think people are much more excited to take Derrick Henry now. It's understandable. If you look at his ESPN price, I wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. There he's going in the middle and round 2. The only way I'm taking him is if you're in a non-PPR format where touchdowns are the only thing that matters. My thing with Derrick, I'm not even taking him on Underdog. Underdog is going back-to-back with Kyren Williams. For the love of God, just take Kyren Williams. Don't take Derrick Henry. He's going into his age 30 season. If you look at running backs that in a similar age 29 season to Derrick Henry since the year 2000, none of them average more than 13.5 points per game. Derrick Henry's gotten worse for 3 straight seasons now. I know it's a much better offense, but I'm going to have a hard time taking him, specifically because his price point, he's already going as RB8, and he's going back-to-back with Kyren Williams. Regarding Zeke and Dowdle, this is a worse Cowboys offensive line than it was a year ago. If Dallas does repeat as a top 5 offense, even though this is a running back by committee, I think that you can safely assume that from a best ball underdog perspective, Zeke and Dowdle return value on for their being drafted at RB 37 and RB 43. If you're looking at where they're going in ESPN drafts, you have Zeke at RB 35. You have Dowdle at RB 50. I think it's up to you with how you want to draft these guys on Underdog. I don't have a great sense of it. This should be a very good offense, at least with how Vegas is projecting it out. On Underdog, I don't know. I do know, however, if you're just drafting on Yahoo, if you're drafting on ESPN, in your regular redraft league, Rico Dowdle is the perfect guy to just take in the last round of your draft. He has an ADP of 166 right now. If you can just get him at the very end, I think it's going to be a very easy spot to know what the roles are going to be for these running backs through the first few weeks of the season, where you're going to know, okay, can we move on from them or should we lean into them? But I think that's all I have for this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. Pretty much the big takeaway is I probably need to lean in and draft a little more Cincinnati running backs. I think with the Miami backs, it's going to be very dependent on the platform that you're drafting on. If you're drafting on ESPN, probably doesn't make too much sense to pass up on Devon Achane. I think that he's a phenomenal price point there at the end of the third as a mid RB2. If you're drafting on Underdog, it will be much tougher. And then, overall, if you're going to look at 2 running backs, you probably should break the tie for the guy that's in the good offense. So I think I need to start taking Zach Moss a lot over these guys like DeAndre Swift. But I think that's all I got for you. Really do appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day, and really hope I get a draft with you in the live stream later tonight.